Hit record. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Tips for Reframing Common Issues at IEP Meetings. This is our second webinar of a free training series for parents and educators, really educating how facilitators can support good conversations at IEP meetings. My name is Jennifer Stewart. I am a project consultant for Peak Parent to work on their alternative dispute resolution project. And I am joined with Michelle Ney, who will introduce herself in just a little bit, who is a facilitator through the Department of Education. So we're excited to have you join us today. Before we get started, just a few items to help you participate in today's webinar. Please remain muted during the presentation. If you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat. To view the live transcript, you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen, and Spanish interpretation is available. So we just ask that you select your language, and that can be done by clicking on the globe at the bottom of your screen and choosing English or Spanish. This session is being recorded and will be posted to our website later for viewing. The webinar is presented in conjunction with the Colorado Department of Education's Alternative Dispute Resolution Project, where we're working to help families and educators learn more about facilitation and facilitative skills. The project is intended to support communication and the resolution of disagreements. We acknowledge that there are conflicts that may reach a point where a more formal process provided under IDEA are needed. Peak Parent Center is a training and information center and does not provide legal advice. And so this webinar is really provided for informational purposes only. Following the presentation, you'll receive an evaluation, and we would appreciate if you take a minute to complete that and provide us with your feedback. So our roadmap for today, just a couple items on our agenda. Just kind of kicking it off, we want to provide you a little bit more information about the Alternative Dispute Resolution Project and how it got started. And then our next 2 points are really sort of what you'll walk away with today, sort of a better understanding of what are common IEP issues, and really providing you with those tips on if we're having conflict take place during those IEP meetings or before or after, some tips on how to reframe those conversations. And lastly, we'll be providing you with information if you're interested on requesting a formal facilitator from the Department of Education, how you can do that. So a little bit about our project collaboration. As I said, I'm here representing Peak Parent, and we're working closely with the Colorado Department of Education's Alternative Dispute Resolution team. And so our representative with us today is Michelle Ney, and she'll introduce herself in just a second. We also are working closely with you all, with family members and school professionals, all with the goal of really supporting students to have more effective and beneficial IEP meetings to get them sort of the services and supports they need to support their goals. And so we're all working together to support those students. Michelle, why don't you pop on and say hello to everybody?
Hi, everyone. As Jennifer said, my name is Michelle Ney, and I am a facilitator with the Colorado Department of Education. Before I came on board as a facilitator, I was the parent liaison in my local school district. I used to be a teacher a long time ago, and I also am the mother of 4 kids. And I say kids, I use that term loosely because my baby just turned 18. But I have been at the table, the IEP table, as a parent at many meetings. 3 of my 4 children were on an IEP at one time. And one stayed on an IEP until he graduated from high school in May. So from the day he turned 3 years old to the day he graduated in May. And then one of my children was on another one was on an IEP from kindergarten through 6th grade and then transferred to a 504 plan. But we can talk more about kind of personal stories as we go along. But I just wanted to say hi, and I've been with CDE for 2 years. I love facilitating, and we'll hear a little bit more about what facilitation can do for you as a parent in your meeting.
Great,
So
thanks, Michelle. All right, so before we get started, we thought, and you don't have to write this in the chat, you can write it in your own personal piece of paper or just kind of in your head, but we wanted to just kind of get you engaged in thinking about what was one question or thing that you were hoping to learn from today's webinar. Our goal really is that hopefully we'll be able to answer that with the content that we provide, and if not, we would love to circle back with you at the end and make sure we do answer that question. Sorry, just checking the chat. Yes, this webinar is being recorded, and so we will be sending that out afterwards. All right, so to start off, we wanted to just provide you with a little bit of background as to what the Alternative Dispute Resolution Project is and really how it got started. So Alternative Dispute Resolution Project started in Colorado in 2013, and at that time, a group of stakeholders were meeting a resolution advisory board, and they were really meeting for several years and kind of looking at different promising practices of how we could rethink dealing with sort of conflict resolution to support our state. And so it was around 2017 that Colorado made the decision that they wanted to create a model that was really utilizing the power of facilitators and facilitation. So in 2017, that's when facilitators came on board. And the project really is, the goal in the mission is to provide a funded support system and toolbox of options for all special education stakeholders in order to increase a more collaborative IEP process and improve relationships. So where did sort of the need for an alternative dispute resolution project come from? So on this slide, we sort of have that graphic, and maybe it resonates with you, maybe you're laughing. It says the IEP meeting, it didn't go so well, right? And there's flames in the background, right? So we know that unfortunately, a lot of conflict does occur related to the development of the IEP, also the implementation of the IEP. And so sort of knew that this was something that we needed to think about how to address and how to, make it a little bit easier on both sides of the table. We know for parents that there can often feel that there's a natural imbalance of power, them feeling undervalued in the IEP process, right? Sort of walking into that room and having all of those professionals and feeling that you're kind of not equally represented. And so how can we develop a program that helps to support making everyone feel a little bit more valued who sits around the table? We also know that sometimes school staff members, administrators, families, they often become so focused on the disagreement and engaged in that relationship, strained by the unresolved conflict. And so it kind of holds people from moving forward. And this last bullet here is really sort of one of the key areas for why I think Colorado decided, okay, we need a program in place, is recognizing that school districts were spending over $90 million per year nationally on conflict resolution. So not just an issue, here in Colorado, but across the United States, we're seeing, a lot of conflict happen related to special education. So that is sort of some of the key reasons as to why this project got started. And so as I mentioned, our solution was really around developing a model that focused on having facilitative skills for all IEP stakeholders, in recognizing that facilitative skills are helpful every day, at every IEP meeting, and in particular before disagreements become disputes. And so this model that we've developed here in Colorado is really a preventative model to make sure we're providing skills, opportunities to have conversations before we're getting into that, another more formal way to deal with a dispute. The model here in Colorado is also kind of unique because we have different tiers for how we want to think about supporting facilitation. So at the top tier, we have more formal level where we have staff who are actually Department of Education employees who are facilitators, such as my colleague here, Michelle Ney. So she is an actual staff who's trained to be a facilitator. And in Colorado, I believe there's 3. I think the goal is to have 4 that split up the state. At the next level, we also have facilitators sort of more at that local level. They could be in your districts, they might be at a BOCES, that have also been trained in a not as formal way, but to also be a facilitator that could be called into your district just to support you at an IEP meeting. And then one of the coolest things about this project and kind of my work with Peak Parent is also just sort of our belief in our training and what we're trying to do when we get out in the community is really promote this idea that facilitation is a skill that everybody can have. And so working with parents and professionals to have you sort of leave these trainings and feel like you have some of those facilitative skills as well. So what is facilitation? So facilitation is about having an impartial person come into a meeting and help to facilitate discussion. They're promoting effective communication and participation by all. So really making sure everybody's voice is heard, kind of just having that person come in and make sure that nobody's being left out of the conversation. Facilitation can be something that happens at formal IEP meetings, but it can also be something that's requested to just happen for another special education meeting. So, you know, nothing is too big or too small when we're talking about utilizing a formal facilitator or some of these skills. It is a voluntary process, and it does need to be agreed to by both parties. When I say that, I'm talking about that more formal request that I'll speak about at the end of the webinar, that just both the school district as well as the parent need to agree that this is something they want to proceed with. And just ultimately, right, we know that these skills are going to make our IEP meetings more effective. We're going to be able to go through an agenda, feel like we're leaving, and have something that we actually did accomplish. Now, what facilitation is not? So facilitation is not having an advocate represent one side or the other. So that's really important. As I said on the last slide, it's really somebody that's impartial. It's not a third party coming in and saying, somebody wins and somebody loses. You know, the parent is right here or not. So when we're in our webinar today, we're really going to provide you with the skills to help to neutralize conversations if they do rise in conflict. Facilitation is not a mediator or confidential mediated agreements, and it is also not due process. So with that, let's sort of get into some of the main aspects of this webinar and talk about some of the common IEP issues that we do see coming up. And so at this time, I'm going to pass it on to Michelle.
All right, thank you. And Julie, I did see that you put in the chat about implementation and kind of that communication piece. And so hopefully we will answer your question, but we'll have an opportunity at the end to talk more in depth. Specifically, you bring up a really good point, and you might recognize some of those themes as we go through the next couple slides. And so we, as facilitators, we see a lot of different.
Oh, sorry, Michelle, I muted you. Sorry.
That's right. Feel free. No. And one of the, do you want to advance to the next slide? Perfect. And so what we see is, even though there are lots of different topics and lots of different areas for conflict to arise, the number one reason why conflict occurs is miscommunication, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. We also talked a little bit about balancing the power in the room when we that was on one of the first bullets that Jennifer talked about. And so if you want to go to the next one, one of the things that we have as a tool in our toolbox. We don't really use this as facilitators, but we do offer this to parents and to when we're doing trainings. And a lot of times you'll be sitting around as a parent, and I just want to check in. Is everybody on the call today here attending basically as a parent? Or do we have any? No. Do we know that, Jennifer? Is everybody here a parent? Parent. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk mostly from that perspective, but if you are representing another seat at the table, okay, great, parent and educator. And so this parent input form is something that we have found can be helpful for parents, for family members. When you're sitting around an IEP table, most participants in that meeting have some kind of a report that they're going to share from. And then parents are often asked to share their information kind of on the spot and without having, okay, great, LaTanya, thank you. Without having the benefit of the kind of framework that a report can provide. And so not all family members need this, but some do. And it can be really helpful to be present in the IEP meeting that you're attending for your child or for your student, to use this as kind of a framework to gather your thoughts, to maybe trigger some different things that you might like to share that you otherwise, if you're kind of asked on the spot or even ahead of time, kind of what's your input? Well, I don't really know what my input, I know some things, but this kind of gives you an idea of the scope. And obviously it's not limited to this, but it can be helpful if you are one of those parents who would really benefit from having something more formal to share at a meeting. So we do suggest this to both school staff to provide to their families, but also when we're doing parent trainings. All right, go ahead. So that was a little bit of an aside. We had asked you to think about what you want to get out of today's webinar, but we'd also like you to think about maybe a specific concern or source of conflict that you all are experiencing now. And if you just take a moment to think through that, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end of the presentation to be able to talk through things, not with specifics, certainly not using any personally identifiable information, but kind of conceptually. We'd love to be able to help you specifically with some concerns that you have and they're bringing to the table today. All right, next. Oops, okay. All right, and so some of the sources of misunderstanding that can lead to conflict that we're seeing and have been seeing over the past few years, and I would love to hear from you if maybe you have some ideas that are not represented on this list. It's certainly not exhaustive. If you'd like to put that in the chat, we would love to be able to have this be kind of a dynamic interaction, a dynamic conversation, and we would like to update our information as we carry this forward into additional trainings and share this information. We want to make sure that we're hearing from the field. And so if you have some ideas that are, and some experiences that are not represented here, please add those in. So certainly understanding IEP terms, different understandings, different interpretations, not knowing what the process of service delivery looks like in practice or at different stages. And that may connect a little bit, Julie, to your question that you had put in the chat that we'll have an opportunity to talk about later. Lack of complete information, making assumptions, back to that communication piece, information without context, and inconsistent practices, and then back to being able to identify what those practices might look like. All right, the next one. Services missed while schools were operating remotely. That is something that is new to us over the last few years, but I think we're still continuing to see the impacts of that. Health concerns relating to in-person school, returning to in-person school. We saw a lot of that last year in particular. Private therapies, that's something that's coming up quite a bit. Especially around ABA therapy and how that can kind of interface with the school schedule. Behaviors, least restrictive environment or placement, push in versus pull out services, accommodations and modifications, evaluations and data, and the home school communication piece. And so some of these are certainly topics that we've seen over many years, and others are newer ones. Does anybody have anything that you would like to add to that in terms of something that you're experiencing or would like to add to this list? Lack of staffing is huge. Thank you for bringing that up. Thank you so much for adding staffing to that list. We definitely need to incorporate that into this slide. That is a huge, huge, huge issue. We're seeing it. I can speak to Colorado. I imagine we're seeing it nationally. We are certainly seeing it in Colorado. And you layer special service providers onto that. You layer districts that may not be able to compensate their service providers as well as neighboring districts. You layer remote districts onto that, and it gets very, very complex and very, very challenging. So that's huge. Thank you for highlighting that, Aspen. All right, anybody else? Oh, initial evals, identification. Yes. So Renee, thank you for bringing that up specifically around the initial and the disability categories, especially when behavioral needs are part of the conversation. Appropriate instruction, the way the school treats instruction in special ed, FAPE, and LRE. Students in special ed may not be getting their instructions from gen ed teachers and pulled out. Seems like gen ed teachers hand off students to special ed team, and that is also a really important consideration, and something that we have been trying to message, not in the role of facilitator, but certainly in the realm of special education, that a student is in general education first and foremost, and they are a gen ed student first, and a special ed student as additional supports and services are required. And so that's a really huge piece, and also where that interplay of services and service delivery, where that occurs, and the need for specialized instruction, those pull-out services, and how that can impact the instruction in general education. And so to be very intentional about that. That's a really great point. Thank you for bringing that up. Anybody else? All right. Are we ready to move on to the next slide then? I'll turn it back over to Jennifer.
Okay. All right. So hopefully this is why everyone came, right? So really getting those tips on, well, how can we reframe some conversations if conflict is occurring? So what we wanted to talk about is how do you reframe? And we wanted to do some practice related to this one because often it can be the most difficult to kind of figure out how to do a reframing because things can get very toxic, right? So we're going to provide sort of these bullets which are strategies on the process of how do you go about this. So you can kind of, we have some examples that we're going to walk through, but also if you have your own, feel free to sort of think through that, right? So when something is said to you, first you want to think about, you want to identify, well, what is toxic in that statement? So we also have the instructions on the next one, so you don't have to write them all down. But so identify what is toxic. Then you want to find out what is important in the statement. So what is important? And then you want to reframe that statement from negative to neutral. Okay, so this is the key point here, is that we're going from negative to neutral, not necessarily positive, right? Really trying to maintain that neutral, you know, put your facilitator hat on and say, okay, I want to be neutral in this moment. And a really great tip is to use the word important. And so again, we're going to walk through some of these. The goal is that you're really reframing for the speaker to feel heard and valued. And caution is to focus on your response only, and that your initial response does not need to include solutions. So in some ways, you're just reframing, you're repeating something back, neutralizing that statement. Those are sort of the key points. We can go back to that slide if somebody would like, but I also have sort of them bulleted out here. So let's go ahead and look at this example. So again, on the left here, we have, so identify what is toxic, find what is important, and then reframe the statement from negative to neutral, not positive. Use the word important. So the statement that is being said is, my child isn't making any progress. You have not done anything for them all year. So if you want to engage a little bit, if you have an idea, if you could throw it in the chat, if you would like to unmute, any idea of how potentially this statement could be reframed. I'll just read it one more time. So my child isn't making any progress. You have not done anything for them all year. All right, are we ready for the potential answer? There's many different answers for how this could be reframed. Oh, we got something in the chat. Okay, I'm concerned about my child's progress. Can we discuss as a team? It is important to you to see that your child is making progress and you have not seen any evidence of progress. Good. And Michelle, feel free to jump in here too. Renee, that was nice that your statement is using important, right? So find what's important in the statement, and using the word important is often a nice way to reframe. So our kind of simple reframed statement is just that progress is important, right? So from that, what is kind of, what is important? And so the word progress is important. And so that's what we're pulling out.
And I'd just like to jump in really quickly. So Renee, that was a really great job reframing that and kind of adding to it. That was really good. And then I also wanted to highlight Julie's response because even though that wasn't a specific reframe, it was in the way that your statement about how you're sharing that feeling, that was that initial statement is very neutral there. And so you've removed any toxicity out of it. And that's really the point here, is that you can share feelings that can be very strong, very, very painful, and with a really high amplitude. And by sharing them in a neutral way, taking that toxicity out, it really creates that space to have the conversation around it and to open up discussion and not shut anybody down from participating in that conversation. So I just wanted to highlight that about both of those responses. So really great job.
Thanks, Michelle. All right, so let's do another one. We have 3, just so you know. So the statement is, you don't do anything about bullying at the school. You don't care about my child's safety. So you don't do anything about bullying at the school. You don't care about my child's safety. So what are some thoughts on how you could reframe and say that differently? All right, Latanya says, I'm concerned about my child's safety and possible bullying. And then Renee, student safety, especially related to bullying, is important. Very good. Getting a double thumbs up from Michelle. All right, so our you can kind of get the drift is that ours are pretty succinct, right? So just kind of taking that word and just saying safety is important. So being kind of clear, strong statement, leaving it neutral. Any other comments, Michelle? Good. All right, let's do the last one. So it doesn't matter what the team agrees to. Nobody follows the IEP anyway. It's meaningless. And this example actually, I think, relates to Julie a little bit about that follow through of what does IEP implementation look like, right? So maybe this statement resonates with you. So I'll read it again and think about how we could reframe this. So it doesn't matter what the team agrees to. Nobody follows the IEP anyway. It's meaningless. Yep. Renee, following the IEP is important. Latanya, it's important that the IEP is followed. Very nice.
Awesome job. And I also wanted to just mention again that when we come in as facilitators, we're coming in as impartial, third-party, neutral facilitators in support of communication and support of the progress. And so we use very neutral language for the most part. We try. And so we'll say things like, it's important that the IEP is followed, just like you just said, Latanya, or Renee, following the IEP is important. But I also love that a couple of people, both Latanya and then Julie, have, from the parent perspective, said, I'm concerned. And I really, really like that, because as a parent, that's not at all a toxic statement. It's sharing, it gets to the heart of the matter right there. I'm concerned. This is my concern. As a facilitator, we're not going to use that word because we can't say that we're concerned about something. But I just, and so when we do this training and are talking about facilitative skills, we don't use that word, but I love it. I love it here. And I want to keep that in mind as we do more trainings with parents, with family members, that we incorporate that into the training, because that, I think, is really powerful here. So thanks for that.
Great. Yeah, good point. All right, Michelle, you're up.
I didn't need to mute myself again. So another thing that that can be really helpful for communication, and you all know this already, I'm sure, but we just want to highlight this in the context of an IEP meeting. And we do this a lot as facilitators because we have to remain neutral. And one of the ways, instead of making statements, we can highlight certain things is by asking questions. And so this is a really important facilitative skill that anyone can use, whether you're there as a family member or as a service provider or another type of team member, is using those clarifying questions. And one of the big types of questions that we use is open-ended. We use problem-solving questions too, and directed yes or no, depending on how kind of tightly controlled you need to have the conversation. If things are getting very heated, the amplitude is really going up, then you can, but we'll get to that. I do want to highlight the open-ended because that is what we probably use the most, and you get really a lot of bang for your buck with that. So do you want to go to the next slide, please? So it's helpful to identify what the specific concerns are, what the specific issues are. It's helpful for getting more detail. We highlighted here some of the ones that we really like to use. Tell me more about. I use help me understand a ton. I find using these open-ended questions is really an invitational way to get more information. And so tell me more. What does that look like? Using visuals, I think, is really powerful too. And so invoking that kind of what might that look like? Help me understand what that could look like here. So those types of questions. All right, next. And then we also use problem-solving questions. So if you think about it as a funnel, so open-ended is more open, less specific, kind of more general. And then as you get down to a little bit more detailed oriented, and you need to be more specific with your questions, help me understand why this is important to you. And even as a family member, you could ask this question, help us understand why this particular thing is so important. And so sometimes really asking that extra question and opening up that communication, not making assumptions that you understand why something is being done or something's being proposed, really being able to ask, like, help me understand why this is important to you, or why this is important to the school, or why this is important to the team. That can really be a very enlightening question to ask. And then what if we did this? What if we tried this? What would happen if? How could we approach this? So just asking kind of open questions that invite collaboration, that invite creative thinking, can really be helpful and powerful. And then the next slide talks about that kind of more controlled, directed question. You are asking specifically, yes or no, have we reached consensus on this issue? Is this a good time for a break? As a family member, being able to ask, are we able to take a break right now? Don't hesitate to ask for that. Breaks can be very powerful, especially if a meeting is either going long. Let's say you have a 2-hour time frame, an hour into it, you really feel like you need a break, or you can tell that other people in the room need a break. Don't hesitate to ask for that. And then not just asking, have we reached consensus on this issue, but sometimes I'll even ask the question, are we able to reach consensus on this issue? Because that's encouraging people just to kind of engage a little bit longer, occupy that space a little bit longer, even if it feels uncomfortable, even if there's a high level of conflict. Are we able to reach consensus? Are we able to spend a little bit more time here and talk on behalf, and then always talk about, on behalf of the student, and stay student focused. All right. And then working towards consensus, that's always the goal, is to reach consensus. It's not one participant or one person winning or losing. It's about finding an acceptable proposal that everyone can support. And support is the key word here. You don't have to be crazy about it, but you do have to be able to support it. That would be the definition of consensus that we work toward. And sometimes consensus isn't possible. And even identifying that fact can be really helpful. Even if you can clearly identify that you're not able to reach consensus and establish that and communicate that, that can be very, very helpful in terms of next steps and moving forward. Because if you are not able to reach consensus on something, you don't need to spend another 3 or 6 hours talking about it. All right, next.
All right, thanks, Michelle. So we have a few slides, just if you were interested to learn more about how to formally request a facilitator, and then we'll open it up for questions. So a request for a CDE, so a Department of Education facilitator, so for them to come to, again, and that could be for an IEP or another special education meeting. So the request can come from parents, the school, the district, or an administrative unit. But the parties do have to agree to the facilitation. That doesn't necessarily have to happen before a request is submitted, but by the time everybody signs on and the facilitator is coming, then that agreement will need to be signed upon. So after a request is submitted, a facilitator is assigned, and they will contact the district and parents to develop, one, that everyone is on board, and to develop that mutually agreed upon agenda. That wasn't something we talked about today too much, but one of the things that a facilitator really brings to the table is sort of that organization to the meeting, really keeping everybody on task and track for what we're trying to accomplish. So kind of a nice benefit is to have that, you know, something to follow and to keep you moving. So before in-person meetings, as I said, you will have to have the agreement to participate in the facilitation that's signed by both parties. And if it's virtual, then verbal consent will need to be given for a hybrid or virtual meeting. So pretty simple to make the request. The website is here. So it's cdeState.co.us/spedlawADR. And it's just a smart sheet form right on the home page that you can click on to submit a request. Catherine Rains is the sort of lead of this project, the Alternative Dispute Resolution project. So she works for the Department of Education. She is over Michelle, and there's, I believe, 2 other, including Michelle, facilitators in the state right now. So if you are interested in learning more, if you're interested in requesting a training potentially, something a little bit larger just than that individual request for a meeting, the best recommendation is to reach out to Catherine. Her email's right there. And then we just have some additional resources for you all, right? We have the CDE website that provides more information about IEP facilitation. The Peak Parent Center also has a website with different resources related to ADR and dispute prevention. A great national resource, so a couple links here, is Cadre. And so they have a couple different articles that are also helpful if this interest is, you know, is a topic that interests you and you would like to build your own skills, right? So that's sort of our model, is you can formally request a CDE employee, or you can also kind of continue to learn and gain those skills yourself to hopefully have more engaging and effective meetings of your own. So with that, my information is there. Again, I'm a consultant for Peak Parent. If you have specific questions, you know, regarding your upcoming IEP meeting or a conflict, the best recommendation is to really reach out to our parent advisors. So Peak Parent has lots of parent advisors that have great experience in training. All of them are trained related to this project, and so they can also speak to different resources and be of help for you there. So with that, let's kind of open it up for questions and make sure either that initial question you wrote down, if you want to circle back to that and we can answer that, or anything else that came up, we'd love to address. And feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself.
So Julie, you had put in the chat at the beginning tips about IEP implementation after the meeting. How do parents have a better understanding how it's going between meetings and progress reports? And that is a really great question. And it's one that comes up quite frequently. And, that it can be handled in a number of different ways. It can be agreed upon more formally in terms of how the school is going to communicate with you. There are, some people find communication logs helpful. Some people find email, at certain intervals helpful. And so it really depends on what you negotiate with the team. Don't feel like you have to wait, though, for those like 3 or 4 times a year progress reports. That can be a long time. And especially if you have new things on your IEP, which hopefully you have every year, but something brand new to the IEP, you want to see how it's going. You can also ask for a check-in meeting as well. So it can be anything from a communication log to a phone call to email to check-in meetings. And so does that answer your question, Julie?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's helpful. And I think it's a bit of a strategy, and to your point, may not always be negotiated formally on the IEP. And because I think there is some resistance from the team to document that happens on a regular basis. And so just, being proactive on the parent side to make sure I am requesting those check-ins ad hoc, perhaps, or on, like you said, on intervals.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. And if anything else comes up, just be sure to reach out. Jennifer, we don't have my contact information on here. I can put my email in the chat as well. But I want to get to Renee's question in the chat. Any suggestions for how to address amount of time designated for a meeting? For example, if one party specifies the meeting will be limited to half hour and the other feels that this is not adequate amount of time to fully address the topics or the IEP development. That is a great question. And as facilitators, we really push on the amount of time allotted for meetings. And so typically I ask for a facilitated meeting, if at all possible, to schedule it for 2 hours. Sometimes, because of people's schedules during the day and to make sure that everybody can be there, whether it's a work schedule from the family's side or coverage back to staffing and substitutes, to make sure that the general education teacher can be there the whole time, for instance. We'll facilitate a meeting that's an hour, but I would like to empower you to be able to push back on the notion that an IEP meeting can happen in half an hour. And so some can, but if you feel like you want to have that deeper level of discussion, and it's something that you want to request, don't hesitate to really ask for a longer meeting. And there's some schools and some school districts that say, we do 45 minutes for an IEP meeting and an hour for a try, or an hour and a half for a try. And that's okay as a starting point. And it's certainly okay if that's all the time that it takes. But there also has to be room for a family to say, you know what, I really want to have the opportunity to talk about this particular concern, or to spend extra time on accommodations or extra time on this. And so I would ask that we be able to schedule for a little bit more time. The way I typically ask that as a facilitator is I say, if at all possible, are we able to schedule for 2 hours? And if we're able to end early, that's great, but then we don't have to spend time trying to reschedule at the end of the meeting. And you can ask the question and just see where you get it. Is that helpful at all?
Well, and I'll just add, Michelle, one thing that I've learned from you is that also what can help to sort of build maybe what the timetable should look like is having an agenda, right? So if you have 20 items on an agenda, you know that a half an hour is not going to be enough. And so taking the time to have that mutually agreed upon agenda can also realistically help to set sort of a time, the amount of time that should be required. So hopefully that's helpful. And, I said a facilitator can help to develop that, but that's also something that you could just do with your team to help make the meeting, move effectively.
And having that, and thank you so much for bringing that up. I never miss an opportunity to talk about how much I love having an agenda at a meeting. And so it's so important because you are agreeing specifically to that time frame, and you're also agreeing to the scope. And you can be overly ambitious with your agenda, and that can help be a data point for expanding that time frame before the meeting, ideally. I've also facilitated meetings where that time frame is communicated as something, and then somebody says, oh, but by the way, we have to end at such and such a time, or oh, but by the way, we have a lot more time. Then and that I think is unfair to all participants, because if you're able to schedule for a specific time frame, then everybody can count on that. Everybody can schedule accordingly. That's not to say, and I will do this as a facilitator, if we're getting close to the end of our agreed upon time frame, and we're also close in a discussion point, I will ask, I'll say, and I'll actually do this at the beginning of the meeting. I say, do we have a hard stop? Let's say our example here, do we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, or are we able to continue if we're at a really important discussion point? And if somebody says, no, we have a hard stop at 1 o'clock, then I honor that. We start on time, we end on time, because that's really important to honor people's time and commitment to the scope of the meeting as well. And so an agenda can really help you do that. And if as a family member, you would like to have an agenda at the meeting, say, offer and just say, hey, I would love for us to come up with an agenda together. So it's not you coming in and presenting, this is my agenda for the meeting. It's also not the school team saying this is our agenda for the meeting, but have an agenda that has been created by all participants, or at least all participants have had the opportunity to give their input. Can really be, it can build momentum too, because you're already agreeing on something before you even walk in the room. And so I love having an agenda. All right, we've got one more. We've got another question.
Yep. Aspen.
Okay, so we've got, Aspen, and then Renee also added something too. How do I know if we're asking too much for our son's IEP? They keep saying lack of staffing limits them, which I understand, but we also want to advocate for our son. Exactly. And really be unapologetic about that. You are your child's best advocate. And so I think it's not what you ask for, but also how you ask for it. Don't feel like you're asking for too much. You can, there's nothing wrong with asking for something and being open to having that conversation about it. And so I think you can ask for what you feel your son needs. And then within that context of the IEP development, be able to have that conversation. If the team agrees, yes, your son needs this, then that can lead to another conversation of how do we support this? How are we able to implement this? And so don't not advocate for your child because you feel or you're sensitive to lack of staffing, which is a real issue, but that's not to say that you can't have that conversation about that. Does that help, Aspen?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah, and Renee's comment was also just sort of sharing a story about feeling limited on time and making that request.
Mm-hmm.
to follow up. So
Yeah.
kind of speaking to what you were saying. So, well, I don't want to take up too much more of our time. We only have a couple more minutes. So I just want to say here, feel free to, stay on if you have one other question, but thank you to Michelle for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this webinar, and please fill out the evaluation as it does help with us for our future programs. And just on behalf of CDE and Peak Parent, thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of your day. Hopefully we'll see you at the next couple of webinars. We have one in December, and then we'll be doing 3 more this upcoming spring. So stay on the listserv, and we'll hopefully see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. And I put my email in the chat, so don't hesitate to reach out to me if I can be of any assistance, or if you want to discuss any of your questions or anything we talked about today further. Thank you.
Thank you.